Chapter 6, Act 6, Rydia's Tale. Act 6, Rydia's Tale. The Eidolons Shackled. Mysidia. Porum burst into the uppermost spire of the Tower of Prayer, pausing in the doorway to catch her breath from racing up the entire tower of stairs in one lengthy dash. Although she was pleasantly surprised to see the elder still up and about for the day, he had seemingly made a miraculous recovery that morning when she brought him breakfast. She was more so surprised to see Anja and Megan return from Baron, each standing a few feet behind him and exchanging troubled looks. When had they snuck in?
Welcome home, you two. What is it, elder?
The elder shook his head, gesturing for Porum to join him in at the full-length window he was gazing through. The spire of the tower, in which there was always at least one inhabitant praying, be it for the crystals, a blessing, or a miracle in a time of crisis, was the shape of a perfect circle and had 4 windows that stretched from the snow-white marble floors to the crystal and dome ceiling, positioned exactly for north, south, east and west. On a clear day, one could see the peaks of Mount Ordeals from the eastern window, which was the closest most residents of Mysidia would ever get to the cursed mountain. Porum peered outside the window facing the south, raising her hand to shield her eyes from the glaring sun. At first she thought the elder had been watching the twin moons, the new arrival seemingly larger than it was yesterday, but his chin was tilted down, his palms pressed against the glass.
Elder. The dragon. It's crying,
the elder rasped, his voice still weak from the near-constant coughing that had plagued him for the past few days. Porum frowned, redirecting her gaze toward the shoreline instead. Even from their distance high in the tower, she could see the white waves of the ocean churning with agitation, swirls of water crashing into each other in the early beginnings of a vortex. Mount Ordeals, Crossing. Kane Highwind paused at a grey, barren ledge, narrowing his eyes that were shielded behind the midnight blue helmet he wore, which was shaped like a dragon's head. Astonished at what laid before him, he slammed his lance into the craggy floor of the mountain path so forcibly that sparks burst into the air from the clash of steel against flint, fizzing into nothingness seconds later. A gust of stinging wind swept through the pass, rippling the crimson sash trailing from his helmet and chilling his ungloved hands as they clutched the lance. The rest of his body was adorned in dragon-scale armor the color of the nighttime sea, contouring such to his slender build that it was like a second skin. He was staring incredulously at the twin moons that had made their appearance over the summit of the mountain, and although his pulse was quickening as the menacing light spilled over him, he realized it wasn't because he was afraid. He didn't know how long it was that he had been asleep, but to wake up to a phenomenon such as this. Surely, it was a herald of what would become his ultimate triumph. For what had been the first time in countless years, his dreams had not been blood-stained nightmares, where he was left for dead or brought to his knees by shadow-clad enemies, begging for mercy and forgiveness. This last sleep, he had risen from the dead like the phoenix of legend, dousing the prison his soul had been entombed in with divine flames, and had become a dragoon knight reborn. He realized he just needed to bide his time, now. Just a little longer, and the path to his reclamation would surely be opened up before him. By moonlight. A fragile smile curled over his pale blue lips as he whispered into the wind.
Cecil.
15 years prior. Mist.
Peaceful days have finally returned to our homeland. We have taken up the goals you strove for in life. I only hope that we will receive your blessing.
The group of villagers bowed their heads as their chief finished reciting his eulogy. Before them was a moonstone-colored granite grave marker, with flecks of green and blue crystals embedded within that caught the bountiful sunlight that poured into the misty valley every morning. Carved into the headstone was a portrait of an enchanting young woman, whose eyes were closed with lips pursed in prayer. Curled around her bare shoulders was the image of the mist dragon, an eidolon that had once been the sole protector of the village before war had broken out. Underneath, a message had been scrawled in elegant script.
Here lies the motherly summoner who protected our village.
2 soldiers from Baron had slain the mist dragon guarding the entrance to the village, and as a result, killed the summoner that had been bonded to that dragon. That same terrible morning, mist was razed to the ground, and the peaceful, isolated life that the villagers had once enjoyed while quietly bringing their children up in the art of summoning was irrevocably destroyed. It was nearly 2 years after the war had ended, and Mist had only finally been able to start really getting back on its feet. Most of the former residents had perished in the Great Fire, leaving only a few children who had been saved by their parents or fortunate villagers who had been away during the attack to sort through the painful wreckage and begin anew. and the village's undoubtedly most famous resident, a 7-year-old summoner named Rydia, who had miraculously survived the Baronian assault and gone on to save the world from Zamia's all-consuming darkness, had never been able to bring herself to return for more than a few days at a time during Mist's reconstruction. The heartache of that cruel summer day was still too much for Rydia to endure among ashen shadows of incinerated houses and shallow, hastily dug graves. Additionally, coming into contact with the villagers who had known her in her previous, pre-war life served as a constant reminder that there had been yet more robbed of her than even what Baron's flames of war had selfishly consumed. When Rydia had left the village, she had been but a child. But when she was swallowed by Leviathan in a disastrous accident on the northern seas, the bizarre time flow of the Feymarch, the homeland of the very monsters she summoned, had aged her body and mind rapidly. The result of her stay in the Feymarch was the spiriting away of 9 years of her childhood, transforming her into a young woman in what had been mere weeks in the human world. And whenever Rydia felt that she had finally made peace with that footnote of her life, an innocent question from a village child, or a pitiful stare from one of the few remaining adults reminded her as gently as being pricked by a needle that she was not in fact, over it at all. But today, Rydia had set aside her fear and apprehension she normally associated with returning to the surface world for two of her most precious friends. She had had a dream that the heir of Baron was to be born very soon, and she yearned with all her heart to be by Cecil and Rose's side when it finally happened. There had been multiple coronations, a wedding, and many birthday celebrations and revitalizations of nations once fallen in the 2 years since the war had ended, but a baby was most symbolic of a fresh start to Rydia, something she didn't realize she still had not yet quite achieved for herself until she had had the powerful dream just the night before. In her dream, she had been walking barefoot along the shorelines of Baron, gazing up at a midnight sky that was sprayed with dazzling stars so close that she was tempted to reach up and try to grab one between her slender fingers. As much she had grown to love the Feymarch, one thing she missed more than anything about the surface world was the ability to see the stars every night, framed by the mountains of the Misty Valley, and make wishes upon them like she had when she was a child. A tender cry rang out behind her, when Rydia whirled around, a wave washed to shore, spraying her feet with ice-cold water that made a shiver run down her spine. In the distant stretch of the black water that was churning from the low tide, Rydia saw the reflection of not one moon, but two. Following the reflection's trajectory into the sky, she saw their planet's moon, round and full in the sky, and a smaller waxing crescent hanging just below, shining with pure white light reflected upon it from the bigger moon above as they both slowly rose into the sky.
Cecil.
When she had woken up, she had known right away what the second moon meant, that the heir to the Holy Paladin was on his way. And she was convinced that the heir was to be a prince. The all-encompassing ocean that had surrounded her and drowned her senses in its scent told her that the baby was to be a boy, thanks to some of the old wives' tales she had heard as a little girl. But I still can't get over the strange way Azura acted when I said goodbye this morning. Rydia was frowning to herself as she quietly approached the gathered villagers, and they were so mesmerized by whatever they were staring at, they hadn't yet noticed her. Normally Azura would wish me safe travels and tell me to give her regards to the others. But today, all she had said was,
"Farewell."
Rydia pressed her palm over her chest. Sometimes, I think she can look right into my heart. But I'm terrified at what she thinks she sees. If she even senses a fraction of doubt about my being in the Feymarch, will she think me ungrateful for my time there? The Feymarch became my home when I had nothing left, the king and queen my family. Nothing can ever replace that. One of the villagers had lifted her head and spotted Rydia out of the corner of her eyes, gasping.
Rydia.
Rydia offered a reluctant smile and waved.
Greetings. What is everyone looking at?
The villagers instantly parted down the middle, as if the question had come from the queen of the Eidolons herself. Rydia felt her heart falter as her eyes fell upon the gravestone, the image engraved upon it so similar to her own appearance that for a moment she thought she had stumbled into the future and had encountered her own final resting place. But as her eyes traveled down to the entwined dragon and the inscription, she realized that the face she was staring at was not hers, but her mother's.
Mom.
Rydia whispered, her smile instantly fading into the ether. That's right. Mommy had me so young. She would have been the age I am now, 18, when she gave birth to me. She was only 25 when she died. No wonder we look so similar now.
Welcome home, Miss Rydia,
a small boy smiled.
We just said a prayer for your mother, and you appear like this. What a blessing. We missed you.
Rydia didn't respond. She had silently sunk to her knees before the gravestone, her fingers pressing into the lush, freshly sprouted grass that had miraculously grown back from what had been previously scorched earth. Even though most of the world was under a cold snap from the midwinter months, Mist had always had its own odd weather patterns, even before the catastrophe. Insulated away in its own valley, there could have been a raging blizzard just south in Barren or a desert storm due east in Capo, and Mist would just be experiencing another sunny, spring-like day. Scholars who had tried to study it came up with nothing rational, and the residents of Mist were simply raised with the understanding that because of their intimate connection with the Feymarch, it was entirely possible that their little village was on a plane of its own. To them, that was as acceptable an explanation as anything else. The village chief, an elderly man with a red and white flecked beard that dragged past his feet, saw the look of concern on Rydia's face and folded his hands nervously.
What's the matter, Rydia? I thought you were supposed to be in the Feymarch. Had we known you were visiting, we would have waited for you.
Rydia managed to shake her head to silence his worries, but was still confused about another matter altogether. In terms of a tribute to her mother, she couldn't have dreamed of anything better or more fitting, nor would she have wanted the villagers to wait on her to erect such a memorial to their village's former guardian. She had been important to all of them, after all, not just Rydia. The gravestone was absolutely beautiful, the artistry that had gone into the portrait of her mom alone must have cost thousands of gil, and even the little man-made pond the grave was positioned next to it had been restored to perfection, once destroyed by the fire when it had filled up with rubble and ash slurry. The clear blue water was sparkling in the sunlight with a rainbow of flowers, hyacinths, lilacs, lilies, and more, planted along the banks. Her mother had loved to teach the village children about summoning arts next to that pond, and would even summon little water sprites from the depths for them to keep as pets. But the restoration of the pond would surely have to have been pricey as well, since there were no villagers that could have possibly been skilled enough to complete the work on their own. They would have needed to hire an engineer from another kingdom, like Barren.
How could Mist possibly afford this?
Rydia blinked.
With the restoration costs of the village and everything. It was an anonymous benefactor.
The village chief began, and Rydia lifted her head, suddenly hearing new footsteps approaching. Whipping her head around, she saw a delightedly familiar sight. It was King Edward of Damcyan, dressed in his usual bard attire for getting around unawares, his wavy blonde hair tumbling over his shoulders and practically glowing in the sunlight. With his pale features, wide, doe-like brown eyes, and pale pink lips, he could have easily been mistaken for a forest nymph. He was flanked by two guards in black uniforms that were a few steps behind him, each of which looking a little bewildered that they had wandered into such an unusual little village.
Edward!
Rydia cried, rising to her feet and running over to him. Before he could even greet her, she had thrown her arms around his neck, burying her head in his shoulder and taking in the soothing scent of his leather vest and rose cologne. Edward laughed and gave her a chaste kiss on her forehead, pulling back to give her an once-over.
How long has it been, Rydia? I'm so glad to see you well. You grow more beautiful every time I see you. Edward.
Rydia blushed.
Well, I suppose it's been near 7 months. So the answer is too long. What brings you here today?
Edward smiled.
I've been traveling quite a bit as of late, surveying just the right spot to put the new harbor that is being installed south of Capo. With Harley keeping down the fort, I've been able to move much more freely than before. I thought I would stop by to see if there was anything else I could do to revive the fortune of this village since I was in the neighborhood.
Rydia bit down on her lip.
But doesn't Damcyan have it hard enough right now?
Last year, she had not been able to attend Damcyan Castle's restoration celebration due to a troublesome interloper that had taken on Rydia's identity too. Well, no one had really figured out what her objective was, and Rydia had ended up obliterating her, with no further trouble occurring after the fact. But Rydia knew just from keeping up with what she could of the surface world's news that rebuilding Damcyan Castle had just been the beginning of many more efforts the kingdom would have to go through to function as it once had. They too had been victims of Baron's treachery during the war. Unfortunately, the initial basis for Rydia and Edward's friendship was that both of their hometowns had been bombed by Baron, and had lost everything as a result. Edward's parents and his fiancée had been murdered, just like Rydia's mother and village friends. Edward shook his head.
Don't worry. Damcyan has many citizens to help aid in its reconstruction. Those of us with power, like Cecil and I, must think about more than just our own lands. We worry over the fate of villages like Mist, too. Cecil, too.
Rydia trailed off, glancing back toward the gravestone. Edward peered over her shoulder, and crossed his arms over his chest. That was new. And he knew it hadn't been Cecil who had had it installed, based on the conversations they had shared about who would provide what aid to Mist. Baron had made most of their contributions nearly right after the war, sending white mages to Mist to heal the sick and injured and having paid for most of the home and shop restorations. Edward had stepped in after the fact, since he had needed to navigate Damcyan through its own crisis first. He was very curious about where the funding for such a beautiful memorial had come from. If Harley had signed off on such an expense, he would have surely heard about it. Eblan Castle.
Your young highness.
Edge cringed as he turned to face the one man he both loved and hated most in the world. He thought he had been quiet enough, patting gently on the plush carpets of the Eblan throne room so that no one would realize he had left his throne. But somehow, that crafty bastard, who was a million years old and half-deaf, could pick up on Edge's exit from a room away and had managed to come strolling out at just the right time to catch him in the act of leaving. Seneschal folded his hands behind his back, peering at Edge with narrowed eyes. He was going half-blind too, but did it really matter when he seemingly had eyes in the back of his head?
Where might you be going?
Edge laughed a little too loudly and waved his hand.
Just for a little training session.
Seneschal raised his eyebrows. He didn't believe a damn word of that, but he had actually had another bone to pick with the king today, so he let it slide, for now.
I have heard for many of Eblan's great treasures are being sold for profit.
Well, this lecture took a little longer to happen than I had originally thought. Maybe Seneschal is slowing down just a bit. Edge put his hands on his hips.
And why not? What's wrong with using Eblan's treasures to help with Eblan's recovery?
Seneschal snorted. That was as close as he would get to being defiant toward King Edge.
I can only hope that proves to be the case, your young highness.
Edge rolled his eyes, like their conversation was the biggest waste of his time in the world, and turned back around to saunter away. As soon as his back was to Seneschal, he could feel the blush that always crept over his ears when he stretched the truth just a bit, and tugged up on his cowl to make sure his face had maximum coverage.
Anyways, I'm off. Of course, Cecil too.
Edward exclaimed, tearing his attention away from the gravestone and looking back at Rydia.
I have word that Fapel is providing vast shipments of vital resources, too. Even Yang.
Rydia shook her head, tears starting to blur her vision. Yang, who had a newborn princess and a kingdom of monk acolytes that he needed to train up on his own, was thinking about my little village?
Rydia.
Edward frowned, reaching up to gently brush away a tear that had slid down her cheek.
It was all thanks to your help that we all made it through the last war. We all owe you dearly.
Rydia sniffled and folded her hands together, a smile slowly blooming on her face. She remembered the terrifying final battle against Zemus, and how she, Cecil, Rosa, Kane and Edge had stood together during their final moments on the moon, knowing that after going through an ordeal like that, there wasn't anything in the world that could possibly overpower the faith they had had in each other, the faith that had steered them through Zemus's vile hatred unharmed. Yes, time and distance had started to put a strain on what once was, but Rydia was vowing to reverse that. That was why she had returned today of all days, after all. A fresh start. We don't have to travel together or have a common enemy to get back what we had, Rydia told herself. I believe in us. Azura would call me naive. But she just doesn't understand the human heart, right? Rydia touched Edward's shoulder.
Don't be silly. Everyone helped each other back then.
Baron. Cecil was standing against a wall in an empty chamber of the west tower of Baron Castle, his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes silently followed Sid's husky form as he paced and back forth frantically, well on his way to wearing a hole in the carpet that marked the path he was grinding into it with his massive, oil-stained work boots. The late afternoon sunset was pouring through the windows, casting pink and gold patterns upon them and the floor. Other than the steady ticking of a clock hanging in the far corner and the hurried shuffling of Sid's feet, the chamber was entirely silent. Cecil was getting dizzy from watching the old man dither about and finally let out a sigh loud enough to distract Sid, causing him to pause mid-step and look up.
Calm down already, Sid. I can't believe you're taking this so lightly, Cecil.
Sid huffed, shaking his fist.
She's been at it for half a day now.
Cecil ran his fingers through his hair for what had probably been the 100th time that day, and shook his head. Like he hadn't been counting the minutes since Rosa's handmaiden had burst into the throne room in the middle of his daily briefing with the Red Wings, screaming that Rosa's water had broken while she was trying to help the poor queen dress for the day. As of that morning, Rosa had been a week past the due date that her midwife had originally predicted, and looked as if she had taken to swallowing watermelons whole for every meal, her stomach was so swollen. She had never exactly warmed to the idea of having handmaidens after she had become queen, but had now needed them for the most simple of tasks, including bending over to put on a pair of shoes, now that her stomach dwarfed the view of her own feet.
What should I do?
Cecil had cried, leaping from his throne and ready to follow Penelope up to his Aunt Rosa's bedchamber.
Stay out of the way.
Penelope barked, and fled as quickly as she had appeared. Cecil blinked as the red wings, including Biggs and Wedge, started to laugh mercilessly.
Best leave this to people who know what they are actually doing, Your Highness,
Wedge giggled.
Yeah, you did the only part you were good for already.
Biggs snickered, and the group roared again.
Ugh.
Cecil groaned, recalling the endless teasing that had gone on for the rest of the morning until he had been able to make his leave. Suddenly, a door slammed open, and a petite figure wrapped in green silk appeared, her hair wild and streaked with melting snowflakes.
Is it over yet?
Rydia gasped, slapping her hands on her knees as she bent down to catch her breath.
Oh gods! Why is this castle so big? Rydia!
Sid exclaimed.
Girl, you came all the way here from the Feymarch? How did you know? Here for the big day, hey?
Cecil asked, grateful for the distraction. Rydia exhaled deeply and nodded, finally able to talk again. She ran to Cecil, and they pulled each other into a tight hug.
I had a dream all about it.
Rydia exclaimed, looking over Cecil's shoulder at Sid.
Has the baby been born? Well,
Sid began, but there came another interruption, this time, a high-pitched, infantile wail coming from the floor above.
What? What? Rosa!
Cecil cried, breaking free from Rydia's embrace and bolting up the stairs in a blur. Rydia and Sid looked at each other, and Sid laughed, scratching his head.
And I thought he wasn't worried. Cecil is still too cool for his own good sometimes. He can even trick me, after all these years. Oh, come on.
Rydia grabbed Sid's hand, practically dragging him up the tower stairs.
We've gotta meet the baby.
Rosa was curled up in her bed under several layers of sheets, her hair pulled back into a half ponytail and her cheeks flushed as she gazed up at Cecil, a blissful grin on her face. Cecil was grinning back, clutching her left hand within both of his. Her right hand was resting protectively over the squirming bundle of blankets next to her on top of the sheets, which the midwife had just gently deposited after completing the cleaning and swaddling. Rydia leaned in anxiously on the other side of the bed, taking in the baby's beautiful pearl-white skin and stunning blue eyes, eyes that resembled the blue planet itself as it could be seen from the moon, just like Cecil's. A tuft of platinum blonde hair that was so fine it was nearly white was sticking straight up from the baby's head. The baby flicked its gaze up toward Rydia, and she could swear she saw a smile form on its rosebud lips.
It's a healthy baby boy.
Rydia squealed, and Rosa looked to Rydia with wide, but happy eyes.
Yes. How did you know? Just a hunch,
Rydia giggled, and Rosa laughed softly. Of course. How could she have forgotten about Rydia's incredible sensatory abilities? She wondered if she should have asked Rydia long ago what she thought the baby would be instead of keeping herself and Cecil in suspense the whole time. The whole of Baron had seemed to be holding its breath, wondering if it would be a prince or princess born among them.
You did us proud, Rosa.
Sid exclaimed.
He's absolutely perfect. Thank you, Rosa,
Cecil breathed, and leaned in, cupping her face with his hands and pressing his lips to hers. Rosa closed her eyes, leaning in closer as Rydia and Sid exchanged sly looks. The baby let out a sleepy gurgle, and Rosa broke away from the kiss, scooping the baby up in her arms so that everyone could get a better look while she began to gently rock him.
Heh?
Rosa giggled, kissing the tip of his nose. She couldn't tear her eyes away from him, and wondered if this irresistible feeling was what it was like to fall in love all over again. She had never seen Cecil when he was a baby, not even in photographs or portraits, but she knew that he had to have looked exactly like the child in her arms now. Rydia bounced up and down on her heels excitedly.
So, do you have a name?
Cecil turned to face her, smiling.
Yes. We've already picked one.
Rydia clapped her hands together. The suspense was killing her.
Oh? What did you decide on?
Rosa brushed the baby's hair back as he closed his eyes, his cheek gently falling against her breast.
Theodore. After Cecil's mother and his elder brother. I like it.
Sid nodded, stroking his beard. It was an unusual name, but somehow it fit the little prince perfectly. He watched as Cecil kneeled down next to the bed, extending his arms. Rosa gingerly handed Theodore over, and Cecil pulled him close to his chest, closing his eyes and lowering his head. His silver-white hair fell over his face like a curtain, obscuring his face from the others. Rydia could swear she saw tears slide down Cecil's cheek. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen the usually serious knight cry, and thought perhaps she had never seen him cry out of pure happiness. It was a humbling sight to behold, and she almost started to sob along with him. Mom. For me, it feels like you have been gone for over a decade, but for the rest of the planet, it's only been 2 years. And in those 2 years, so much has changed. Cecil, Rosa, Cain, and Edge. They, along with King Leviathan and Queen Azura, became my new family in your place. But still, I condemn myself to isolation in the underworld. I want to be with my friends again. Someday, I'd like to think that I'd want what Cecil and Rosa have. But the Feymarch is free of the rage of men, there is naught but peace and tranquility. I'll never find a sanctuary like that on the surface world, even with my friends. Rydia recalled the traitorous heartbreak Cain had once rendered upon them all, and the untimely death of dear Tella, who had been so kind to her when she had been newly orphaned and mourning her mother. Will I ever find a place to call home that has everything I want? Does such a place exist anywhere in this universe? Rydia reached up, discreetly rubbing the tears away from her eyes before they could escape. She was sure no one had noticed, all eyes were on the new prince, after all. Fastening her smile back onto her face like one would tie a ribbon to their hair, Rydia pressed her palms together.
Nice to meet you, Theodore.
You are so lucky, Prince Theodore. To be loved and adored by so many from the very moment you came into this world. Cherish it. Cherish every precious minute. My wish for you is that you will know happiness with your family for the rest of your days. And Cecil. It's my wish for you too. My dearest friend. I hope your heart finally knows peace. Mist, one day after the moon's return.
Rydia.
A group of children burst into a small cottage in the northeastern side of the village, with no regard for knocking or any other kind of privacy. The village chief, who had been frying chocobo eggs for breakfast and whom shared a home with the missing in-action summoner, nearly jumped out of his robes as he whirled around.
Mother Gaia. What is this all about? Hey, where's Rydia?
A girl in red pigtails pouted.
She's normally up by now. We have to have our lessons. She promised to tell us about summoning chocobos.
The chief laughed and shook his head. He couldn't be mad at them even for nearly giving him a heart attack with their panicked shrieking. The child was right about their missing teacher. Rydia had become someone to whom all the village children had become deeply attached, and she had put them on a routine that you could set a clock to. In a village like Mist, monotony was treasured far more than anything else, and Rydia had given them that precious gift in spades. But today, the children were destined for a bit of disappointment. The village chief was a little surprised that Rydia had not said anything to them, but even after all these years living as housemates, she still was as enigmatic as ever. He could tell there were still several secrets she kept close to her heart to which no one else was privy.
She doesn't normally do this, but she's taken a trip back to her other homeland. Her other homeland?
A blue-haired boy blinked. He, like the rest of the children who had come clamoring in, were all too young to know of the Rydia who had only been an occasional visitor of Mist. For as long as they had all been alive, Rydia had been a fellow villager and mentor. The chief nodded.
Yes. The Feymarch. Now, if you settle down and set the table, I'll make you breakfast and tell you all about it. That will be your lesson until Miss Rydia returns.
Rydia could see her hand shaking on railing as she stared down into the darkness below. Behind her, there was the usual hushed activity that was characteristic of the Feymarch library. Monsters of various shapes and breeds, dragons, goblins, bombs, just for starters, were gathered around polished tables, dusty tomes opened before them, while some simultaneously scribbled into notebooks. The head librarian, for as long as Rydia had known of the Feymarch's existence, a demon whose yellow eyes were all you could make out from underneath the voluminous purple cloak he wore, was behind the checkout counter stamping due dates into books as an eager chocobo held out a knapsack with its beak. When Rydia had made her entrance, no one had disrupted their activities to even look up at her. They were far too engrossed in studying, and Rydia was the one human that had become a regular fixture in their lives. Although, perhaps with the way time flowed within the Feymarch, they hadn't noticed that Rydia hadn't been there for quite a long while. Rydia took a deep breath in an effort to calm her nerves. Although she had originally intended to stop by just for a visit, it had been a few years. After all, the appearance of the second moon the day before had solidified her resolve to speak with the Eidolon royals sooner rather than later. She had been surprised that no one else in Mist Village had really been alarmed by its appearance, but then again, most of the adults in the village now had been mere children when Mist had burned to the ground, and they could hardly remember what had transpired during the war, let alone understand why the return of a second moon could be a concern. The other adults, like the village elder, had little, if any, magical prowess in connection to the planet that Rydia had as a summoner. As a result, they tended to only be worried about such matters if Rydia told them to be. Not wanting to stir the village up into a tizzy and then abandon them, Rydia had chosen to save her panic for the king and queen. Perhaps they will tell me it is nothing, Rydia thought as she took a cautious step down one stair, and then another, cringing at the creaking sound that emitted from underneath the heels of her leather knee-high boots. But it seems an unlikely coincidence that the moon suddenly appeared around the time I was planning to visit the Feymarch. I know better than to take such omens lightly. On her way to the Feymarch, she had been silently contemplating the troublesome situation of this new moon in the Falcon's Hold while Luca had been piloting the airship. The feeling Rydia had gotten upon first laying eyes on the moon yesterday morning was the exact opposite of what she had felt when she had dreamt of a second moon nearly 15 years ago, the night before Prince Theodore had been born. 15 years prior, she had felt the lightness of hope and renewal, like she could have skipped across that moonlit sea in her dreams as effortlessly as a blessed daughter of the water gods. Yesterday morning, the dread had settled into her stomach like a lead brick, and she had to fight the urge to be sick right there in her bedroom. It felt significant that her old dream had popped into her mind as soon as she became aware of the new moon's existence, and her brain was in overdrive trying to understand the connection. She never forgot a vision. Like her half-lunarian friend Cecil, her summoner blood was prone more to premonitions than the dream states that normal humans had, so she knew her spiritual instincts were trying to convey something to her. But what was it? She could only pray Leviathan and Azura knew, as Eidolons, the very purest essence of magic, their ability to comprehend such prophecies was far superior to hers. Before Rydia knew it, she found herself at the bottom of the stairwell, and in the entryway of Azura and Leviathan's throne room. It brought Rydia great comfort to see that nary a thing had changed in the time she had been away. The gold-plated and marble-walled chamber was still a tribute to overwrought opulence and decadence that Queen Azura laid worship to, with overloaded shelves of treasures lining the walls, some so heavily stacked that they bowed under the weight of the trinkets upon them, but miraculously never broke. They held weapons, bejeweled glasses filled with ancient potions and perfumes alike, baubles and leather-bound volumes that looked more at home in the library above than among such precious artifacts. But Rydia knew from her time living in the Feymarch that those books had contained some of the most ancient secrets in history of the Eidolons and their summoned monster kin, and had been given permission to flip through them at her leisure. Unsurprisingly, she couldn't read a word they said, and most of the pages were so aged that the paper would dissolve in Rydia's fingers if she did not take care turning them. Leviathan's throne was a stark contrast to the luxury around him, although his true form was a serpent who had a penchant for roaming the northern seas and occasionally dragging sailors to their deaths. He spent most of his time curled up in his ancient, threadbare throne that looked as if it had been perhaps salvaged from one of the ships he tortured back in his more active days, reading from a pile of books he frequently borrowed from the library. Azura's throne, however, was a pile of silky, jewel-toned pillows that glimmered in the light given off by the countless glass lamps lit around the room and the magma reflecting off the glass floor below. Azura splayed in the throne more so than sat, today being no exception. Her canary-yellow wrap dress, which was so sensuously wrapped around her curves that it could have been painted on, was spilled over the pillows, creating an effect akin to the sunset against a twilight sky. Rydia noticed that as she stepped from the shadows, Azura's hand fluttered from where she had been weaving something in her lap and flew to her chest, her fingers idly twisting one of the diamonds dripping from the heavy necklace that hung from the length of her neck to just above the pale swell of her breasts.
Your Majesty!
Rydia trailed off, bowing deeply before Queen Azura. She resisted greeting King Leviathan or even looking at him, abiding by the Feymarch's rule that one should not speak to the king without Queen Azura's permission. It had been a rule Rydia had once been exempted from, but now. But Leviathan was entertaining no such pretenses today. Rising from his throne, he set his book aside and clapped his withered hands together, his beard tangling with his tattered robes as he stepped forward to greet her.
Oh. Rydia, my child. Much time has passed since we last met.
Azura pressed her lips together, which were stained the color of over-ripened mahogany cherries, and narrowed her violet eyes into slits.
Why are you here?
Rydia felt her words get caught in her throat, and averted her gaze. Everything she had mentally practiced wanting to talk them about was wiped clean from her mind, like a teacher running their eraser over the day's lesson on a chalkboard. No notes? Too bad. Azura pulled herself up from the pillows, a feat that would even have the most graceful of human women stumbling for leverage, but for her was as fluid a movement as a pirouette across a stage. Stepping directly into Rydia's line of sight, she drew herself up to her full height and glared down at the summoner, her hands cocked at her hips and her exposed right breast heaving with tight, controlled breaths. Rydia couldn't bring herself to look into the queen's penetrating glare, so she had to settle with staring at her chest, a flush creeping up her cheeks.
Have I not made it clear enough? You are not welcome here in the Feymarch anymore.
Rydia clenched her eyes shut, forcing herself to say something. Anything.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to see everyone. And I have need of your counsel.
Azura shook her head, her shoulder-length earrings whipping so hard that Rydia feared she would lose an eye if Azura got much closer.
Now that you have seen them, it's time for you to leave.
Rydia turned away, clenching her fists. They won't even listen to me.
In case you have forgotten, you are not a citizen of Feymarch, Rydia.
Rydia's lower lip began to tremble uncontrollably. Totally forgetting about the twin moon and the pained sense of urgency she had felt all morning until Luca had finally deposited her at the entrance to the Feymarch, all she could think about was how she had used to have a bedroom in the very chamber below where she was standing, where she had been raised with love and grace from a 7-year-old orphan to an 18-year-old woman by the very two figures before her. She could feel loose strands of hair tangled painfully in the ruby hyacinth hairpin she had nestled against her scalp, gifted to her from Azura's collection of treasures when she had first opened her eyes in the Feymarch and was terrified she had died and awoken in hell. She whirled back around, taking a hesitant step forward.
But can't I at least come back to visit every now and then? You won't even let me do that. We cannot,
Azura hissed.
You don't belong here. We've discussed this.
Rydia whimpered. I thought enough time had passed. I know now that you could sense the doubt in my heart when I got home from seeing Prince Theodore all those years ago, and you wanted me to return to the surface world so I could try my chance at happiness as a normal human girl. I didn't understand your reasoning then, but I did later on. I just needed the time to realize it. But then when I told you a few short years ago that I finally understood what you were trying to do for me, you told me to take heed of my lesson and never return. I can't believe you really meant that. And I still don't. Please, tell me what I did wrong. My heart still does not belong entirely to the surface. And I fear it never will. Leviathan turned to Azura, frowning in pity behind his massive beard.
Rydia is like a child to us. Surely it wouldn't hurt to let her come by.
Azura shot him a glare that could have lit him aflame right then and there had she willed it. Rydia stood helplessly before the king and queen of the Eidolons in their chamber, feeling as if someone had taken her heart and squeezed until it had burst into nothingness. But despite the queen's cruel words, she would not let herself cry, she would not give Azura the pleasure of witnessing her in an emotive state, which she knew the queen would consider a weakness of humans like herself. As she straightened her spine and raised her chin defiantly, she noticed that Leviathan had paused, not looking at either Rydia or Azura. He cocked one overgrown, wiry gray eyebrow and stepped forward, his face falling. Rydia suddenly forgot about her tough girl act and rushed to Leviathan, fearful that he was about to collapse, for he had turned white as a sheet in a matter of seconds. She broke one of the Feymarch's most sacred rules, and spoke to him without having gained Queen Azura's permission first.
What is it?
Rydia whispered, grasping his hands in hers. She was shocked to feel an agitated tremor, and realized that it was coming from Leviathan, and not herself. Leviathan shook his head, and finally brought his gaze to Rydia's. She saw her diminutive form reflected in his cloudy violet eyes, and realized that although he was looking at her, he was not seeing her. Something else had captured his attention.
No. Listen, my dear Rydia, you must leave here at once. What?
Rydia blinked.
Why all of a sudden?
Can't we even talk about this? Ashura pressed her fingers to her lips, closing her eyes. Instead of becoming enraged with Rydia like she had been only moments before, she instead offered the summoner a delicate smile.
There is nothing to fear.
As Ashura spoke, she opened her eyes again and reached up, bringing her fingers from her lips to her left temple and resting them there. Unconsciously, Rydia mirrored her, reaching up and brushing her fingers over the ruby hyacinth hairpin that was nestled in the untamed waves of hair that poured down her shoulders in a cascade of emerald. Leviathan formed a blue orb of light between his cupped hands, and quickly tossed it at Rydia. Before she could run away, she felt the light wash over her, binding her arms and legs to her sides and paralyzing her from the neck down. She opened her mouth to cry out, but was spirited away from the chamber in a flash of blinding light before the scream could even escape her throat. When Rydia opened her eyes, her head throbbed so painfully that she feared she was concussed. She found herself on the wooden plank-lined streets of the Feymarch village, tossed only a few yards away from the gaping maw of the cavern that would take her back to the underworld. Climbing to her feet, Rydia grimaced at the scrapes that streaked across her upper thighs, some of them lined with tiny dots of blood, and could feel the dull pulse of bruises starting to form all over her body. The green and golden-plated, V-necked leotard she had chosen to wear due to the oppressive heat of both the surface world's summer thus far and the journey through the underworld had done little to protect her from her rough landing. The sleeves that ran down the length of her arms had gotten torn and the exposed flesh of her hips and torso was starting to turn red with inflammation. She reckoned she must have bounced a few times before finally sliding to a stop. The glass-beaded fastener that had held her airy green capelet over her shoulders had shattered, exposing the bare ribbons that Rydia had to retie in a clumsy knot. Rydia reached up, letting out a small sigh of relief when her fingers brushed over the undamaged hairpin still sitting in her hair, although now it was tangled interminably in her wavy, waist-length locks. Shocked that no one had come running to see the ruckus she must have caused, she muttered under her breath.
What just happened?
The village streets were utterly still, she couldn't even hear the chatter of any of the town's monsters as she tried to collect herself. Taking a lap around the village square, she was dismayed to find that no one was around, and wondered if Ashura's decree had somehow managed to reach everyone already, forcing them to go into hiding until she went away. Just when she was about to give up on her search, she spotted a dark grey hooded figure standing in front of the sundries shop. Wondering if they would lend her some gil to buy a potion to help heal her injuries before meeting back up with Luca, Rydia tapped the monster's shoulder.
Excuse me? Could I borrow some money? I'm really sorry, but it's kind of an emergency.
However, there was no reply, not even a flinch on the monster's part from the uninitiated contact. Rydia blinked and tapped again, noticing this time how hard their shoulder was underneath her fingertips. It wasn't the feeling of someone that was particularly built from working out, not that Rydia had done much muscle caressing in her life, it was stiff, and cold. Like a corpse. Rydia cleared her throat, making one last attempt to make her presence known.
Are you all right?
She slid in front of the monster, and had to keep herself from screaming aloud. The hooded figure was the librarian helping the chocobo that Rydia had seen earlier, and his glowing yellow eyes were now two dull granite stones, frozen in place. Reaching up, Rydia tried to pull his hood back, but it was unmoving, fused to his head within, which was a mass of black, unmoving shadow.
Oh, no. You've been completely petrified.
Rydia whispered, running her hands down his chest and shaking her head. There was no heartbeat, no movement of breath. Absolutely no sign of life.
Who would do something like this?
She glanced over at the entrance to the sundries shop. If they had a golden needle. She ran inside, nearly tripping over her own feet when she saw that the eidolon behind the counter was in the same state as the librarian outside. It was a bomb, but instead of the usual bright red or blue hue the bomb inhabitants of the Feymarch usually were, this one was a pale, lifeless grey, and he was staring through Rydia like she wasn't even there. Rydia stifled a sob and went to the shelf of medicines, digging around in the dusty bottles and boxes until she found a golden needle. Pulling the cap off of the needle tip, she leaned over the counter, biting down on her lip as she clutched it in her fist, preparing to stab it into the bomb's arm. The golden liquid within the vial sloshed around with the trembling of her hand.
Forgive me.
Rydia grimaced, and looked away as she brought the needle down. But instead of the needle plunging within the petrified flesh, she heard a plink. And the needle broke off the syringe, clattering to the floor. When she looked back to her hand, she saw that the golden liquid in the syringe was steadily dripping out over the bomb's flesh from the opening where the needle had been, but there was no change in his condition. In a standard state of petrification, the victim's bloodstream was still active, and would carry the concentrated levels of medicine throughout the body to quickly heal someone's entire form. But Rydia realized she was dealing with an entirely different illness. The bomb's flesh was so hard that it wouldn't even accept the needle, which surely meant there was no circulation beneath as well. Rydia dropped the rest of the syringe on the floor, letting it shatter behind the counter as she backed away. She knew no magic that could possibly cure anything like this. And the most powerful white mage she knew in all of the Feymarch was Queen Azura herself.
The Queen will help you,
Rydia said softly, although she wasn't sure if the bomb could hear her.
Please. Just hold on a little longer.
Rydia turned and fled from the sundries shop, racing deeper into the town square's lower layers to make her way back to the library. Although she wasn't surprised, she was still sickened to see that other groups of Eidolons she came across were in the same state as the ones she had found above. Some were in the middle of talking to each other, their mouths half open and their hands raised mid-conversation. As Rydia ran, she swore she could feel their eyes following her. Inside the library was the same heartbreaking scenery. The monster who had taken over for the cloaked librarian, a cockatrice with a pair of spectacles sitting on his beak, was frozen midair high above the checkout counter, reaching for a book. The chocobo that Rydia had watched eagerly collect his books was preparing to sit down at a study table, his wing extended toward the chair he had been pushing out. Although the library had normally been a quiet place, probably the quietest building in all the Feymarch, Rydia had never realized just how much activity and bustle there had still been even when there were no voices. The sounds of chairs scraping across tiled floor, pencils scratching in notebooks, and the gentle sigh of pages as they turned had completely evaporated, leaving nothing but the sound of Rydia's labored breath rushing through the room like a hurricane. Rydia pounded down the stairs, crying out for Azura and Leviathan before she even crossed the threshold. She thought perhaps if they could hear the urgency in her voice before seeing her, that they wouldn't immediately banish her with their magic once again.
Your Highnesses. I'm sorry to disobey you, but... the townspeople.
Rydia's voice died in her throat as she entered the throne room. Her eyes burning with tears, she stumbled forward, shaking her head as she pressed her fingers to her lips. She had been foolish to harbor such absurd hope. Leviathan and Azura were as dull and spiritless as all the rest. Leviathan's mouth was open, and he had his arm held out and his right foot stepping forward, as if to shield Azura. Azura had her scimitar raised high in the air, her lips contorted into a battle cry. Rydia circled them slowly, checking their statue-like bodies for any signs of exterior harm, wounds, burns, or frostbite from magic, but there was nothing that indicated any kind of battle had actually taken place. Rydia pressed her lips together in a straight line, shaking her head. Whoever, or whatever had done this, had managed to do it in only seconds. They hadn't needed to weaken the king and queen. Their magic had been enough on its own to take them out instantaneously.
Rydia! Why did you return?
Rydia gasped and whirled around, swearing she heard a voice come from Leviathan. He was still staring straight ahead, and hadn't moved even a fraction of an inch.
I'm sorry, Rydia. You should be in the land of the humans, not here. Queen Azura.
Rydia whimpered, whirling back around to face the queen. Same as Leviathan, she was as still as the statue she now resembled. Rydia let the sobs emerge from where she had been trying to contain them deep within her burning lungs, not caring who could hear her 33-year-old self wailing like a child. There was no one left alive in the entirety of the Feymarch to think any less of her weak human emotions. Not anymore.
Your Majesty. Your Highness. This is all my fault. I came back here despite your warnings, and now look at what I've caused.
Rydia recalled the last time she had been overwhelmed with such hopeless agony. It was the morning that mist had burned to the ground. She had been sitting outside by the pond with her mother, learning about one of her most favorite summons, the monstrous Gigas, Titan. In the middle of a really exciting story about how her mother had entered into a covenant with Titan in order to call upon him, her mother had turned deathly pale, as white as the mists in the cave beyond the village gates. She wordlessly slumped to the ground, nearly falling face first into the pond, had Rydia not miraculously summoned the strength to catch her falling form and pull her into her lap. As Rydia shook her mother and screamed her name over and over, she felt two cold shadows wash over her. Looking up, she saw two figures, a menacing demon in armor as black as the night and a taller, elegant man with a ski-sloped nose and pale pink, downturned lips peeking from beneath a dragon's head helmet. Pausing at the village gates, the demon reached into his armor, pulling out something small that glinted in the morning sun and made Rydia squint her eyes. Moments later, the village burst into flames around her, and she could feel the smoke rapidly extinguishing any breath she had left in her lungs as the voices of her fellow villagers rang out in a torturous chorus. She decided right in that moment that she was fated to die with her mommy, but that she was going to take the two invaders with her as well. She watched with narrowed eyes as they slowly approached her. The demon lifted the visor from his helmet and revealed two crystal blue eyes, stained with anguish. Rydia pressed her palm against her forehead and was surprised to feel it slick with sweat. For a moment, she felt like she had been in the middle of those flames once again, the acrid stench of burning flesh and wildlife wrapping around her as she clutched her mother's already stiffening corpse. She shook her head, backing away from Leviathan and Azura's silent forms. No more. I don't want to lose anyone else anymore. Never again.
I will find a way to save you,
Rydia sniffled.
I swear to it. Even if it means I can never come to the Fame Arch again.
As she trudged through the winding tunnels of the Fame Arch cavern that would eventually deposit her back on the surface of the underworld, Rydia was first shocked to see that all of the lava that had previously boiled so close to the surface of the cavern floors had completely dried away, petrified in a sea of murky gray and white bone matter and calcium deposits. Under normal circumstances, one would need at minimum a float spell to pass through safely, or in Rydia's case, a ride on the back of a fire-loving eidolon like Ifrit. Was Azura or Leviathan controlling this lava the entire time? Rydia wondered. What will protect the Fame Arch from invaders if this first line of defense is gone? Her second shock came when a gang of Domovoi, underworld cousins of the surface world's goblin, crawled out of a deep crack in one of the cavern's walls and started to approach Rydia with their collection of stolen weapons, maces, broken knives, and worn axes favored by the dwarven folk, feeling braver now that the lava that normally kept them at bay had conveniently disappeared. Rydia had used to hunt monsters in the caverns when she lived in the Fame Arch, but when she had an eidolon at her side, the creepiest of the cavern's inhabitants tended to leave her alone. I need to tell everyone about this as quickly as I can. Rydia thought, reaching to her hip and snagging the handle of her whip that hung off her belt. I don't have time for pithy distractions like you. Swinging her whip in the air and snapping it across the floor of the cavern with a violent crack, Rydia drove the gang of Domovoi back, and raised her left hand in front of her, closing her eyes.
Ifrit.
Rydia cried.
Burn this scourge so I can continue forward.
But whereas she would normally expect to hear the roar of flames surround her and watch Ifrit emerge from a fiery womb before her eyes, there was now only silence. Even the Domovoi gave each other confused looks, one of them scratching his head with his knife point and accidentally impaling himself. Rydia bit down on her lip. So. It hadn't just been the regular citizens of the Fame Arch that were affected by the mass petrification.
Ifrit. He won't even answer me,
Rydia whimpered, feeling her heart start to pound harder and harder with growing despair.
Does that mean Bahamut? And the rest?
In a fit of rage, Rydia blew the Domovoi away with a Firaga spell, which was overkill for small fry like them, but she was so distraught that she just wanted every obstacle that dared cross her path to be gone, and quickly at that. With each new encounter, Rydia desperately tried another summon, Ramu, Shiva, even the All-Father himself, Bahamut, and none would heed her call. After each failure, she would cast Thundaga, Blizzaga or Flare instead, wiping the monsters that dared to challenge her off the face of the planet.
Hang on, my dear eidolons. I will save every last one of you.
Rydia sobbed through blinding tears as she cast yet another spell to clear her path, her voice's pathetic echo parroting back at her throughout the twisting tunnels of the cavern. When she finally breached the surface of the underworld, Rydia was about to pass out from the massive drain on her mana she had foolishly brought upon herself. With no healing items on her person, she hadn't expected to be fighting for her life in the caverns alone, after all, and not even enough power to cast Osmos to try to drain an unsuspecting monster of their mana to absorb into herself. Rydia collapsed in front of the mouth of the cavern, gasping for breath as she tried to spot the falcon and wave Luca down. But Luca and the falcon, both of which were awfully hard to miss on the tiny island the entrance to the Fame Arch sat upon, were nowhere to be seen.
Wah!
Rydia moaned, pushing her fingers through her hair to force it back from her face. It didn't help much, she was starting to see double from not being able to focus her dilated eyes.
Where did they go?
As she struggled to rise back to her feet and stagger forward, she heard a loud screech ring out from above her, and whirled around just in time to be dive-bombed by a massive Ziyu. The black and purple flecked bird, which could best be described as a raven on steroids left to bake for 100 years on the hardiest, most unforgiving mountain peaks, swung a razor-sharp talon toward the hapless summoner. Rydia felt the sting of the laceration ripping open across her chest before she could even attempt to raise her arms in defense. Stumbling back and falling on her rear, Rydia brushed her hand over her newly acquired wound, marveling at the amount of fiery red blood that was dripping from her fingers as she lifted her hand to see. The color of flames. Rydia thought to herself as her eyes involuntarily slammed shut. Sinking down to the ground, she felt the heat of the underworld start to give way to a pacifying, cooling breeze, like the way her mother's mist dragon used to nuzzle her maw against Rydia's hand and snort into it, blowing out diamond dust particles of ice and rain that made Rydia's fingertips sparkle like they were dipped in shattered crystals. Mom. I can't do anything. It would seem without my eidolons, I'm no good to anyone.
Boom. Caw.
Rydia felt the ground underneath her body shudder, forcing her head to loll sideways. As she slowly opened her eyes, she could feel a hot gust of wind blow over her and make out the shadow of something massive landing a few yards away. It was a cherry-stained airship with a gargantuan silver drill attached at the helm, and the pilot was barreling down the unfurling ramp of the ship before it had even completely touched down.
Luca.
Rydia gasped, pushing herself up a bit more by her forearms and wondering if the unsuspecting dwarven princess could see the impending danger of the Ziyu. But when Rydia turned her head back toward the cavern, she saw that all that was left of the monster was a smoking carcass that was burning away into dust, scores of loose black feathers blanketing the ground around her. Luca skidded toward Rydia, sliding down to her knees and reaching into the blue rucksack hanging just below her ample chest, fishing out a collection of glass bottles. Before Rydia could reach for them, Luca popped the cork off of one and started pouring the contents down Rydia's throat, making her gag and protest as the medicine flooded her mouth.
Ack.
Rydia coughed, and Luca tossed aside the empty bottle, reaching for another. Rydia managed to snatch it from her hand, shaking her head as she tried to catch her breath.
Thanks. But I'm good now.
Rydia gasped.
I'll take it from here.
She could already feel her wound closing up and healing, much to her relief.
I was thinking you looked like you could use a favor,
Luca smirked, sitting back on her haunches. Rydia swiped at her mouth, wiping away the remains of the potion she had been force-fed before popping the cork of the ether she had grabbed from Luca.
Where did you come from?
Rydia asked between sips, never much caring for the sour, bitter aftertaste ethers always left on her tongue.
I thought you were going to wait for me.
Luca reached up to adjust her visor, tapping her finger against her full, apple-shaped cheek that popped rosily when she grinned, which was almost always her constant state of being.
I was so bored that I went to make a few engine improvements. I'm just testing them out now. One of them was that sweet homing missile that burned that Ziyu to a crisp. Master Sid's going to give me a full engineer's license once he sets his eyes on that. I wasn't gone that long.
Rydia pouted, looking Luca over. Her bubblegum pink shop romper was covered in oil and grease stains, where it had been perfectly clean when she had picked Rydia up from mist earlier that morning. Her pale leather gloves were smudged with God's new what, and her bright red goggles, which she bought to match Sid's, were hanging around her neck. Shaking her head, she stood up, brushing the dust and ashes off the remainder of her clothes that hadn't been torn. Now that she was functioning again, the terrible scene she had stumbled across in the Feymarch came screeching back to the forefront of her mind. And there was something about the hallucination she had had about the mist dragon before nearly passing out reminded her of another potentially troubling scenario she wanted to get a grasp on, quickly. Looking down at her hands, Rydia bit her lip.
Anyway, that's great about the missile, Luca. But what about the crystal in the dwarven castle? Was it safe when you went back to the castle shipyard?
Luca's almond-colored lips twisted in confusion, and her gold-flecked eyes flashed.
The crystal? What's that about all of a sudden? We have trouble, Luca.
Rydia sniffled, and began explaining the whole sordid tale starting from when she had entered the Feymarch throne room, but leaving out the fight with Queen Azura. She hadn't actually told anyone about her previous banishment from the Feymarch. It would have made for some awkward questioning if she had ever wanted to go again, like today. When Rydia was finished, Luca tapped her foot and kept fussing with her visor, which either meant she was nervous, thinking, or both. Rydia waited anxiously for Luca to say something, anything, and finally, the dwarven princess let out a deep sigh.
I knew something was up. Oh.
Rydia blinked.
What do you mean? Well.
Luca shrugged.
I said that I was out on a test flight. But that's not the only reason why I was gone. Something's definitely up, you can tell from how the number of monsters suddenly multiplied out of nowhere. So I thought it'd be a good idea for me to take the Falcon out on a patrol while you were visiting.
Rydia raised her eyebrows.
The monsters down here have multiplied? I'm impressed your father allowed you to do that, that being the case. He doesn't really know about it, ha. Getting him to let me be an engineer's apprentice was painful enough. That sounds much more like the King Ja I know, I'll say that much. But I'm glad you're safe. The same goes for you,
Luca nodded. Suddenly, a loud explosion bellowed in the distance, causing both women to nearly jump out of their boots. Without hesitation, they barreled up the ramp of the Falcon to get a better look at what could have happened. Dashing to the helm of the ship, Rydia could see an airship approaching King Jot's castle to the east, and it looked nearly identical to the one they were on now, with the exception of the missing drill. Another explosion rang out, and this time, Rydia could see what had made the terrible sound. It was a barrage of cannon fire letting loose on the castle, sending plumes of smoke and fire bursting into the skies above.
Oh no!
Luca whispered, her eyes widening. It was all she could bring herself to utter as her homeland was laid to siege before her very eyes. For the first time ever, Rydia witnessed Luca stunned into silence. Rydia gasped, pressing her hands to her chest.
Was that the Red Wings? That ship?
Without answering, Luca ran to the steering wheel of the Falcon, firing up the engines in record speed and releasing all of the airship's brakes with a flurry of grinding gears. As Rydia stared stupefied toward the castle, she watched the mysterious airship make one last pass with cannons and then fly away as quickly as it had appeared. She thought she heard Luca shout something, but her mind had filled with an incessant buzzing, assailed with random images running so quickly together that Rydia could feel her eyes rolling in the back of her head trying to keep up with them all. The twin moon, the petrified eidolons, a gathering mist, her mother's grave. And finally, the image of a young woman who could have been mistaken for the Rydia of 15 years ago, her eyes filled with cold malice as Bahamut appeared by her side to battle against the real Rydia and her friends in the Tower of Babel. The doppelganger had managed to call upon Bahamut with an imposter's hands, an imposter's breath, an imposter's guise.
Rydia!
Luca shouted, and Rydia snapped out of her trance, blinking.
I said, hold on. Right.
Rydia nodded, grasping onto the railing next to her. Luca whirled around, guiding the hovering ship through the motions of liftoff. Rydia turned again toward the smoking castle that had become their impromptu destination, and bit down on her lip so hard that she could taste blood. Cecil? If those were the Red Wings, then what has become of you? End of chapter.